George C. Scott. If acting is about stage presence, there is no finer actor. If acting is about dominating a role, there is no finer actor. If acting is about range, there is no finer actor. Early in his career, Scott was referred to as the American Laurence Olivier, but only one of them had a better Richard III, and it was not Olivier. George C. Scott's fame took off in 1959 and ascended to movie star status by the late 60s, early 70s. His life and career were riddled with alcoholic binges and violent outbursts. He was a complicated man with a complicated past. Ladies and gentlemen, by way of introduction, this is a story.
That would be in the file.
It is not in the file. It is not.
This video is supported by my Patreon.
I see that the story of that town is a dirty one, and its record is bad. Yeah. What about
the stars, the great stars they had in those days that, I mean, people always say we don't have nowadays.
Well,
we don't, that's
No.
true, because they're not processed in the way that they used to.
I don't think that they don't exist.
They don't exist.
They don't.
Don't exist. Movie stars in 1974 don't exist.
Well, why is that? Why should
Because
that
they
be?
exist, they're singers.
Objection.
The 1970s had movie stars like Marlon Brando, Steve McQueen, Clint Eastwood, Paul Newman, for God's sake, and this man, I'm forgetting his name. The statement that movie stardom had died out by 1974 is an absurd one. But is it true? Fame tends to be a fickle thing, but we'll come back to Wells and movie stars later. But for now, I think we've gone long enough without our leading man.
Would you welcome George C. Scott?
George C. Scott.
George C. Scott.
This is 1959's Anatomy of a Murder, and this is the great James Stewart. The great Jimmy Stewart was a titan in the industry, and he had, for my money, the best run in the 1950s, better than any other actor. But Jimmy is not the star of my video, and he doesn't end up being the star of Anatomy either.
No questions, no objections.
Halfway through the film, something odd happens. Halfway through the film, we're introduced to a young George C. Scott, and this Hollywood newcomer steals the show from the great James Stewart.
Your Honor, the counsel has deliberately cut off my view of the witness.
I'm sorry, Mr. Bigler. I wouldn't want to interfere with your signals to Mrs. Manning.
This is Scott's first prominent role in a feature film, and he really shines with the pressure. Initially, the director of the film, Otto Preminger, wanted Scott to play a more minor role, but after his audition, they wanted Scott to play the film's antagonist. Watch this movie and you'll understand why. Scott has such a dominating presence that it's hard not to look at him, even when the director frames him unattractively.
You owe me money!
But we'll come back to this movie and this line of dialogue later. Perhaps Scott's presence is due to the fact that he spent most of the 50s as a theater actor. Perhaps it's just natural-born talent. Either way, Scott is acting opposite to George Bailey himself, and yet Scott dominates this film.
Can condition a man to killing other men. I simply want to determine how conditioned the lieutenant may be to the use of firearms on other human beings.
Scott was a loud actor, and he found a way to make even his subtle movements loud. Look at the way he moves his eyes,
You mean to say, Mrs. Mannion, a lovely woman like yourself, attractive to men?
or the way he blinks. Watch him as he rubs his face, or his hair,
I've wasted about all I have in it.
and when he puts it all together. Critic Harold Clurman used to say of Scott that he was always vivid, always alluring, never less than arresting. But Tarantino has the best analogy for Scott.
Stomping down on the molten lava that is inside of George C. Scott's soul is his stock and trade. And sometimes the movie is about him keeping a hold of the lava,
I never really thought you would.
and sometimes the movie is about it erupting.
Because you couldn't tell the doctors from the patients on the floor? My God! The incompetence here is absolutely radiant.
Hollywood and all of America were enthralled with this volcanic actor. So much so that Scott was nominated for an Oscar. But the Oscars, too, are a fickle thing. In the world of the jet setters and us beautiful people, there's no award more prestigious, more illustrious than the Oscars. Alfred Hitchcock never won an Oscar. What?
Thank you.
From one Oscar snub to another, Scott didn't win for Anatomy, even though he should have. I mean, you don't steal a movie away from the great James Stewart and not win. Unfortunately for Scott, and everyone else at the 32nd Academy Awards ceremony, Ben-Hur trampled the competition and won a record-breaking 11 Oscars. Scott was furious and disappointed he lost, and he was furious and disappointed that he was furious and disappointed. So he swore off the Oscars, famously called them a meat parade, and refused every subsequent nomination. Hindsight tells us that Scott should have won at least 3 of his Oscar nominations: Anatomy, The Hustler, and Patton, which is the only nomination he ended up winning.
Oh my God. The winner is George C. Scott.
Listen again to how excited the crowd were for him.
George C. Scott.
Scott wasn't even there. His 4th nomination comes from Paddy Chayefsky's The Hospital. He lost this Oscar to Gene Hackman in The French Connection. Now I love Gene Hackman, more so than most, but this is arguably Scott's finest performance.
Pietistic little humbug.
And I'll leave it at that. Scott should be sitting pretty next to Katharine Hepburn, but he's not. Has George C. Scott's legacy been marred by the Oscars? I don't know. I do know that by 1971, Scott was one of the top 5 most popular actors in the world, and a year later, he would be in the top 2. Plus, Scott could back up his popularity with 4 Oscar nominations, 8 Emmy nominations, and 5 Tony nominations. And yet, I can never find his name on any list of best actors. I can't even find his name on a Watch Mojo video. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back. Let's go back 80 odd years and revisit one of the last movie stars, James Cagney.
Take him up.
My goodness, Cagney. Cagney, in my view, was maybe the greatest actor who ever appeared in front of the camera.
Really? Yes. James Cagney. Why was that? What was this? What makes you...
First of all, he broke every rule about movie acting. He acted at the top of his bent, and he never hammed for one moment. And there's not a fake minute in a Cagney movie.
I would say there's no secret that Mr. George C. Scott is a man who knows his own mind and a man who knows his actors. He refused to walk on stage to accept an Oscar for his own talents, but he insisted on flying across the nation to be here tonight to honor Jim Cagney and his talent.
Like so many people in this room and so many people all over the world, we have been lifelong admirers of James Cagney.
You know, you're a legend. You know that?
I don't know anything about it.
Well, I mean, how does it feel to be James Cagney?
Nothing.
Oh, you got to be proud of yourself. But you...
Not at all.
Why not?
Why should I?
What he seemed, he was. A wholly human gentleman.
Why shouldn't you? You
It
made
all
people
happened.
laugh. You made people cry.
It was part of the process. Learn how to do it. And did it.
The essential elements of whose positive character were 2 and only 2: simplicity and spirituality.
When you were a little kid, what'd you want to be when you grew up? What'd you dream
Artist.
about? Want to be an artist?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes, Sheila. And that was the thing that I wanted to do. And then time wears on and you do other things.
Thank you for having us here.
Those words were written about General Robert E. Lee, but I was talking about James Cagney. Every character Cagney played had that same captivating energy. The actors he worked with depended on Cagney, and Cagney made them better. He was a perfect gentleman, and in his way, a perfect actor, perfectly himself.
I'm not taking it up with anybody but you. You figure it out for yourself.
The simple, incredible thing about Cagney was he told the truth. That was Jim's great quote about acting. Plant your feet, look the other guy in the eye, and tell the truth.
If I want them to, they're going to break your right arm in 3 or 4 places.
First time I'd worked with George Scott, and he was interesting.
You walk in the wrong kind of place, they'll eat you alive.
When did you adopt me?
I don't know when it was.
The Hustler is George C. Scott's 3rd film. It's only 3rd film. And his 2nd Academy Award nomination is Best Support. He joined the Marines at 16, then went to college, University of Virginia. He started as a journalist major, and then he got interested in acting. And it was Joe Papp that really gave him the break as Richard III.
No one knew what to expect from George in those days. The director of the film, Robert Rawson, didn't know what to expect. Rawson enlisted the help of 5 foot 5 inches Piper Laurie to accompany him when he went to go meet George.
And he asked me to go with him to meet George C. Scott. Everyone was scared of George in those days.
I don't make trouble, Miss Ladybird. Live and let live.
And then during the course of the movie, we didn't speak. I'd worked with him once before. We didn't speak then either. I was scared to death of him.
Maureen Stapleton once told Mike Nichols that she was in constant fear of Scott during their scenes together. Nichols turned to her and said, "Don't worry, the whole world is afraid of George."
And he told me afterwards, he knew that he could never come up with anything that would be as strong for me as what I could imagine.
I'm ready.
As soon as I finish my coffee.
And he was right.
You must have a lot of confidence in me.
I'm finished.
It wasn't until many, many years later that a mutual friend invited me to go to dinner at their house. And he was like a teddy bear. And he greeted me and he picked me up and threw me into the air. Rosie!
Which George was the real George? I don't know.
He was a very different man.
This conflict between writing and acting, and it wasn't until Pabst Richard III, right, that things started to click for you.
That's right.
Back and forth, a lot of stock.
Like how Cagney wanted to be an artist growing up, Scott wanted to be a writer. He tried being a writer for some time, but he ended up acting. After acting for many years, Scott wanted to be a director. He tried being a director, but he went back to acting. Scott always hated acting. He wanted to be anything else but an actor. He threatened to quit acting his entire career. But just like how he always found himself in a bar, drinking himself away, he would always find himself back on stage or in front of a camera, pretending to be someone else.
You have all these actors who have become famous playing these
parts,
characters.
yeah.
But they're not movie stars.
Right.
Captain America is the star.
Right.
Thor is the star.
Gene Siskel once asked Scott what makes a great acting performance. Scott answered a list of 3 things. One of those things was, how does the actor handle the character's key emotional moments? Burt Gordon's most crucial moment comes at the end of The Hustler, when Eddie finally stands up to Burt. Burt makes one final attempt to maintain power.
You owe me money!
Scott and the director of the film argued about the emphasis of that line for 2 days. Rawson wanted Scott to emphasize the verb "oh," but Scott thought the scene was flat and needed a charge, so he chose to stress money. A choice that highlights how weak and powerless Burt Gordon is by the end of the film. Still, Rawson wanted it his way, and he told Scott as much, and Scott told Rawson to shove it. Like most of his arguments, Scott won. Newman was fantastic in The Hustler as well. Like Brando, he was the perfect romantic lead. Forlorn,
Maybe about me.
heart-wrenching. Hamlet.
Actors hamming it up.
Hamming it up?
He's a ham actor. Now, where would that come from?
Hamlet.
From Hamlet? You think so? In other words, guys who would overact the part of Hamlet would ham it up.
Scott was always loud, always booming, but he was never over the top. He never hammed, nor did he ever play Hamlet. He was never seen as the romantic lead. He was always the Richard III. He was always the Black Prince.
Today, a dingo, a fat old razorback, or a nice big...
There were a lot of mavericks, a lot of tough guy actors in Hollywood at the time. But Scott was real. The other actors were papier-mâché. George was believable. The right-hand man and valet of Frank Sinatra, George Jacobs, once related that while Sinatra first admired Scott and his acting, the voice grew to become jealous of the actor. Scott was a genuine tough guy, a former Marine and a brawler who actually beat up paparazzi and nosy journalists, things Sinatra was accused of doing, but never did. Scott received another Oscar nomination for The Hustler, but he outright refused this one. The Academy told Scott he wasn't allowed to refuse a nomination. and Scott told the Academy the same thing he told Robert Rossen. It was around this point that Scott began to get annoyed with the public's perception of him. The world had typecast him as a heavy, and he didn't like that. A heavy is a villain. Some actors do not want to be typecast as a villain.
So I'm the heavy. It's official, old buddy. Who has been.
As luck would have it, I've been cast in a number of parts which have, let us say, distinguished me as a sinister person. I suppose it's because the face. My wife describes it as a relief map of Afghanistan.
In 1963, Kubrick saw a Central Park production of The Merchant of Venice that Scott was in, and Stanley thought this Shylock actor would be perfect for his political black comedy. At this point, most of Hollywood were aware of Scott's volatile nature.
He was involved in barroom brawls, he was tough, he was a Marine, he drank a lot.
And so Kubrick devised a strategy to rein in the volcanic actor. As you might be aware, Kubrick loved chess. He was very good at it. George C. Scott also loved chess, and while I'm sure that Scott was a very fine player, he was no match for Stanley.
Watching George C. Scott looking at the chessboard and planning his moves, and then Kubrick would walk over and just do his instantly and won almost every time.
Kubrick earned Scott's trust and respect by trouncing him in chess, and so Stanley convinced the actor to do a few different takes for each scene.
Mr. President, I'm not saying we wouldn't get our hair mussed, but I do say no more than 10 to 20 million killed, tops.
Kubrick manipulated some of those performances out of George by saying this, okay, George, you give it to me straight or you give it to me simple. Now I want you to go over the top. Give me one where you go over the top.
So-called monogamous sexual relationship, I mean, as far as men were concerned.
The actor thought Kubrick was making him overact, and when Kubrick ultimately used the over-the-top takes, Scott resented it.
He was saying that was not my performance.
However, because Kubrick used the over-the-top takes, he gave us one of the greatest characters to ever appear in film.
A big plane like a 52 room. It's jet exhaust frying chickens in the barnyard.
General Buck Turgidson helped Scott break his typecasting. And not only that, Dr. Strangelove taught the world that George C. Scott was funny.
I think you should all know that I did not come here tonight to make fun of Don Rickles. Neither did I come here to trade barbs, because it would take a comedian to do the first and a true wit to do the second. Instead, I've come here tonight to say something nice about Don Rickles. And for that, you have to have an actor.
I'm so nervous I gotta smoke, don't you?
Come on, what are you nervous about?
I can't show the brand, though. There's only 2 people alive left that smoke these.
There is one criticism of Scott that I would like to mention. Theater director Stuart Vaughan, who worked with Scott, once said of the man, he was just as fine an actor in Richard III as he ever became, and I didn't feel there was any growth. He was a wonderfully talented, wonderfully gifted person with great technical skill from the beginning, and he never lost that. If his emotional, personal life and the drinking hadn't taken its toll, he could have become an even more splendid actor. Whether that is true and fair, I don't really know. I'm neither a critic nor an expert. But as Orson Welles made his argument for James Cagney, I make mine for George C. Scott. I mean, just look at the way he talks to dolphins.
Fish for beef.
I didn't know George Campbell that well. We never talked about acting. Or anything, actually. We never met. Anyway, if you would like to know more about Scott as an actor and as a person, I recommend these books. And go watch his movies. And I leave you with a question. Who do you think was the last movie star? Cagney or Stewart? Brando? Maybe Newman? Maybe Scott? Or did Cagney overshadow Stewart, who overshadowed Brando, who overshadowed Newman, and on, and on, and on?